Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Money Matters podcast, the show where we discuss important financial topics that were never covered in med school. I'm your host, Dr. Tarang Patel. Before we get started with today's episode, I just want to take a minute and thank you all for listening to the first few shows. I've received some good feedback from many of you, and I've also received some areas where I can improve. Thanks for your continued suggestions. If you would, please leave us positive reviews on iTunes and join our Facebook group, and also send us comments at drmoneymatters.com. Welcome to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. Our guest today is Cory Fawcett, MD, a general surgeon in Grants Pass, Oregon. Dr. Fawcett has an impressive background. He went to undergrad at Stanford, med school at Oregon Health Sciences University, and did a general surgery residency at Kern Medical Center. Dr. Fawcett has written a couple of books for healthcare professionals, including his latest, Eliminating Debt. Dr. Fawcett, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you.
We mentioned your background a little bit here, but can you talk about your career as a surgeon and what led you into writing these books?
Yeah, I grew up in Southern Oregon, about a half hour from where I live now. And when I finished my training, my idea was always to come back home. I ended up about a half hour from my family, and my wife actually lives in Portland, Oregon, and we're about 3.5 hours from her family. So we're kind of in between the two, but I always wanted to come back home. So when I finished my training, I came back and found a job here in Grants Pass, Oregon, where I became a partner in a single specialty private practice general surgery group. I practiced in that group for 20 years. And at the end of the 20 years, I was feeling like I wanted to slow down. I didn't want to keep up that pace that a general surgeon does that's busy, and wanted to back off a little bit. And then to do part-time work in my practice wasn't really one of the options. We didn't have it set up for part-time. It was really a full-time business, and there was no contractual way to make part-time work well. And so I sought another way to do that. And I ended up working part-time in critical access hospitals that are nearby. I could just drive to them with my wife, and helping out in places that had only one or two surgeons, and those guys needed a break. And so I did that for 3 more years, part-time, helping out these surgeons. I think I worked at 7 different hospitals during that period. And then just last week, had worked my last day as a general surgeon, and decided to hang that up and concentrate full-time on working, teaching doctors personal finance, helping them get out of debt, promoting the books I've written, and writing future books as well.
Great. So I know for most physician specialties, it's very hard to go full-time to part-time, but obviously general surgery, as busy as you guys are, it's most practices are not set up for that. So it's good that you were able to kind of get a feel for part-time by doing what you were. So
I think every specialty, I believe, can work part-time.
They can, but like you were saying, most practices don't have that mentality. Even in my field in radiology, most practices you can do part-time, but if you're in a private practice per se, the infrastructure, because you have to, maybe provide benefits, or you have 2 part-time people generally have to equal more than 1 FTE. I guess that's what it seems like. And it just seems like more hassle than a lot of practices want to put up with.
It is different, but if it's something you want to do, it can easily be set up. We actually worked out a way for me to work part-time at my practice after I decided I was going to leave the practice. And then when they found out, well, you're going to be working part-time in these other places, could you work part-time for us? And so we actually worked out a way that could happen, and I ended up working a long weekend every month at my old practice. So even in the practices where it doesn't look like it'll work out, if you really want to do that, it's likely that either you can make it work out, or you can find a new one where you could make it work out.
I think you're right. I think now people are looking into these type of solutions more so because, as you said, even in your own practice, I mean, you're a known commodity. So obviously they would work harder to keep you part-time rather than finding someone else to cover what you needed to cover.
I think when the reality hit that I would be out of the call schedule and those extra days were going to need to be picked up, there was some additional incentive to say, could we do something? Is there something we could make happen? And so it turned out I actually took more call than I used to take because when I came on, all I was doing was being on call. And then when I was off, I was completely gone from the practice. So I could take a few more call days than I used to take in that setting. And I ended up taking more call than I was taking when I was a partner.
Okay. So what were some of your favorite things about general surgery, and what were some of the least favorite things about general surgery?
Well, I really love general surgery. If you go back to my roots, I wanted to be a doctor. I got into medical school, and when we got to our third year rotation, I did 3 rotations in a row that I didn't like. Those were just not specialties that were resounding with me, and I almost quit medicine because of that. I just don't like this stuff. This is just not what I want to do. And while I was in that process of deciding whether I'm going to quit or not, my next rotation was general surgery, and I loved it. And that's what I want to do. And the thing that I really loved about general surgery was the ability to fix stuff. I'm a fix-it man, and in general surgery, we fix stuff. When I was rotating on internal medicine, we didn't really fix things usually. We were helping people live with what they have or maintain what they had or do better with what they had, but they still had those diseases that you were trying to help them with. But in general surgery, if you came in with a appendicitis and I took out your appendix, you're cured. And when you walk away healed, it's over. I fixed you.
Right.
And I really loved that atmosphere about it. The other thing I really loved about my practice was in private practice, I could set my own schedule. And consequently, I took a lot of vacation. My dad used to say, "Do you ever work?" But I took a lot of vacation. And in private practice, if you take time off, it tends to just drop your salary. But as long as you cover your call requirements, they tend to be okay with it. And so I was able to take a lot of time off. And the other thing I really loved about being in private practice is I could set my own schedule. A really good example of that was several years ago when I was hosting a visiting doctor who came to talk to our doctors in town. He was at a university, and he was a university employee, and he was getting ready to leave. He says, "Oh, I better go catch my plane." I looked at my watch and said, "Oh, yeah, I got to get to soccer practice." And he looked at me like I was, "What do you mean soccer practice?" Because we were both general surgeons. And he was really busy. And he said, "What do you mean soccer practice? How could you possibly be doing soccer practice?" I said, "Well, I'm a youth soccer coach. And practice starts in an hour." And he didn't quite understand how could you possibly do that? I said, "Well, I'll let you in on a little secret. I'm the boss. If I say Tuesday at 2 to 4 is soccer practice on my schedule, and Thursday at 2 to 4 is soccer practice, that's what's on my schedule. And the office knows I'm going to be there, and they know not to book patients at 2 minutes before I'm supposed to be at soccer schedule. Patients stop at this time so I can get to soccer schedule." And I had free reign to say, this is when I'm working, this is when I'm not. I'm at soccer practice right here. He did not have that. He had to kind of do what they told him to do at where he was. And within a year, by the way, he left that and he went into private practice. I think he liked the flexibility that was afforded. But again, the flexibility, if you take away time from your practice, it just drops your income a little bit. And that's where my book, for instance, on eliminating debt comes in. If you don't have the debt hanging over you, you have free reign to pull your practice back a little bit and make a little bit less money because you don't have to cover those payments.
Right.
And that's what I was able to do. I was debt free. I had private practice. I could set my schedule the way I wanted, and I didn't worry about it dropping my income because the debt wasn't there to pay. And I had a very great life.
So now, speaking of the financial aspect, so you were able to do this because you, at the time, you were saying you were financially, secure. How about prior to that time, maybe earlier in your career? Were you working more hours? When were you able to make that transition? At what point in your career?
Well, I always had lots of vacation time. So that there wasn't a big transition as far as how much time I worked.
Okay.
Keeping debt low initially was a big thing for me. But then, as you read in my book, I told my story. I soon found myself $500,000 in debt.
Right.
And had to work back from that. But I never let my lifestyle get so big that even that much debt affected me, so that I had plenty of leeway. But what it did give me is when I did become debt-free, I was able to drop some of the things in my practice that I didn't like, that the only reason I kept them was because they paid good. And so when I became, the difference between before and after debt-free was really that factor. And those specifically were vascular surgery and thoracic surgery. I'm a small town general surgeon, and we get to do those things. In the big city, I would have never been able to do those things because there would have been some specialist who did it.
Right.
But in a small town, I could do them. I didn't particularly like doing them, but they paid really good. And so I was afraid to get rid of them for fear that would drop my income too far. But when I became debt-free, I had the courage to go ahead and get rid of those. And funny thing, nothing happened to my income because it just got filled with other stuff. I didn't change how much time I worked, but after I became debt-free, I changed the configuration of my practice a little bit with less fear that I had to make my house payment again. I haven't had a house payment since 2001, and that's really freeing.
Right, absolutely. In fact, I'm going to ask you a little bit about that in just a bit, but going back to the financial aspect, do you think that trying to eliminate debt or becoming financially secure, is that the most important thing you think for medical students and residents to improve their odds of long-term success in medicine? Or do you have other tips as well? Or do you think that's like the number one thing they should focus on?
I think there are a lot of things that will make the difference between a great practice and a tolerable practice. In my first book, The Doctor's Guide to Starting Your Practice Right, I address those issues. How do you set up a practice from the beginning so that you like it? One of those issues is debt. And if you don't have the debt hanging over you, it is eliminated as one of the stress factors in your life, okay? Every stress factor you can eliminate is a good thing.
Absolutely.
We have enough stress as it is. I was in a meeting shortly after I became debt-free, and I wouldn't say that I was financially secure at that time. I was debt-free. I concentrated on getting my debts paid off, and I still maximized my retirement plan. But they asked in the meeting, what are you guys doing to relieve stress? And when it came to my turn, I said, I paid off all my debt, and that relieved a huge stress on me. And everybody looked at me like I was from Mars. What do you mean you paid off your debt? Who does that? And that was back when getting this debt paid off wasn't fashionable. And one of the doctors caught me in between and said, well, if you're so blankety blank rich, why don't you just retire? and I said, well, wait a minute. I didn't say I was rich. I said I paid off my debt. Those aren't the same thing, but he equated that only rich people could pay off their debt. And that wasn't true. It was people who've decided to pay off their debt or who can pay off their debt. When it becomes a priority, it's easy to do because that's what you're doing.
Right.
Up until then, it's not even on the radar. I mean, I hadn't even thought about just paying it all off till one day that epiphany came, and I said, let's get rid of this stuff.
And what brought that upon you? What made you think let's do that?
My wife. I was cruising along $500,000 in debt, and I was fine with it because everybody else was doing that. In fact, I was probably less in debt than all my friends. So, but she wasn't feeling so good about it because she was thinking if something happened to me, how would she ever cover all those debt with her income? Because she's not a physician. And so she saw this book called Debt-Free and Prosperous Living on an ad. And she didn't get it for me. She says, your friend here, he could use this. Maybe we should get it for him. And I thought that was a good idea. So we got this book for him. It wasn't really for me, but I thought, if he asked me any questions about this book and I gave it to him, I better have read it before he gets it. So I thought I'd read it first and then I would give it to him. And when I read it, this guy says, you could be totally debt free in 7 years or less. And I thought that couldn't be possible. No, there's no way I could pay all this stuff off in 7 years. That's a 30-year mortgage. And how could this happen? So I started to calculate it out, and it turned out I could get it all paid off in 3.5 years. And I had never even thought of that idea. I asked my wife, I must have made a mistake. Please check this. And she's an accountant, and she says, yeah, it's 3.5 years. I said, you know what? Why don't you order another book for him? I want to keep this book, and let's do this. And we started off on that journey. It didn't take us 3.5 years because we got sidetracked a couple of times. It took us 5.5 years to actually do it. I bought some new cars, bought a bigger house, started a surgery center all in that time frame. So it added some time to the plan. But I went from I'm going to be in debt forever to I'm only going to be in debt for 5.5 more years. I mean, that's the length of my residency, and that's all the longer I was going to be in debt. And that's how we got onto that path.
That's great. I mean, I think that eliminating the debt, but just more than eliminating the debt, like you said, the reduction of the stress and just changing your mindset about your finances and being a little bit more in control rather than just kind of status quo is probably the most important thing. But that many of our colleagues and younger physicians just haven't really thought about. So it's good that you and specifically your wife were able to do that early on.
That control issue is big. I do one-on-one work with doctors to help them get their finances back in order. And the first thing that happens is just paying attention to your finances. That one factor alone makes a huge change to almost every doctor because most of us just don't pay any attention to it. We just spend on whatever squeaks the loudest at the time and get whatever we want. And as long as we're not being in bankruptcy, everything's okay. And they just don't pay attention. So just getting a doctor to pay attention to what he's spending and what he's earning makes a huge difference in their overall financial picture.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you had mentioned in your book was, like you said, the control part. But for example, in your private practice, you said you were able to schedule how you wanted it. And, many physicians now are employed rather than in private practice. And so they lose some of that control. But as you had mentioned in your book, if you are financially secure or have at least eliminated debt, you can at least look back to, if your hospital is changing the terms of the contract, you have some freedom to say, you know what? No, I don't agree with that, and I'm not going to take it.
That's true. And even employed physicians have some control of their schedule. Your schedule is not totally set by your employer. You can walk into the office and say, hey, I'm going to finish at 4 this day, or I'm going to take this afternoon off from patients. For example, what I did, and this could be done with any person who's employed as well, our call schedule is Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And at a busy hospital, by Monday morning, I had a lot of work stacked up that needed to be done on Monday, but I had a full Monday scheduled. So I realized that if I don't get rid of that schedule on Monday, I'm going to have a real miserable day because I got to work all this stuff from the weekend in when I was on call. And so I started, as I termed it, I started taking Mondays off. And people who are employed say, well, I can't take Mondays off. But my wife pointed out to me, says, you never took Mondays off. You just didn't schedule anything for that Monday. You were busy all day long working on Monday because it was the stuff I did over the weekend. So even as an employed physician, you can say, we're not booking any patients on Monday because I'm going to have so much work from the weekend to do. We got to have room for them on Monday. We can't be rescheduling all the patients because I got an emergency surgery to do on Monday. So life will be better for the employed physician and his employer if you're not having to reschedule everything the Monday after your call weekend. So you can even convince them, even when you're employed, that it will work out better for everybody if we don't book any patients on Monday after that long weekend call, and I'll have a room to clean up the weekend and get all these cases done.
Right. Let's talk a little bit more about the employed versus the private practice model. You mentioned some of the pros and cons in your books. Can you go over a few of those for the employed versus private practice?
Probably the biggest pro for being in private practice is that you have total control. You set up everything. You want to be off, you be off. You want to work, you want to work. A lot of doctors in private practice, they only work 4 days a week. They have 1 day out of the office. And I say, well, if you're complaining about your income, you could boost your income by 25% by working that day and work 5 days instead of 4. You have control of that. So the biggest benefit for being in private practice, I believe, is you have total control. The biggest downside is for many people, you have to run a business. And if you don't have any desire to run a business, you will consider that a downer. I'm an entrepreneur. I love doing business. I've had lots of businesses besides medicine, and I like that stuff. But if you don't like that stuff, you'll consider that a downer. One of the biggest benefits from being employed is you can start out with a high salary. You kind of work up. Usually in the private practice, they'll start you with a lower salary and a bonus, and you work into your income as you generate patients. Because when you first start, there is no income. There is nothing happening. You haven't seen anybody. There's no income coming in. But when you become an employee of somebody, they'll start you out at your full salary right to begin with. And then the downside is loss of control. They're going to tell you what you do. A really good example of that is somebody who talked to me once about their vacation time. They're an employed doctor, and he went off to some CME event that the hospital required him. They want you to start doing this particular thing in the hospital, so we're going to send you to this CME event to teach you how to do this thing. So he went to the CME event. He comes back, and when he gets back, he goes to schedule his final week of vacation that year. And they said, well, you don't have any vacation left. What do you mean I don't have any vacation? You used your last week going to that CME. Well, wait a minute. You sent me to that CME. Why are you using my vacation time for that? And they decided, hey, you only have this much time off, and you've used it. So that doesn't happen in private practice. People aren't just telling you what to do. And the problem with that is, since that guy's paying your salary, he has a lot of pull on you. If you have a lot of debt, you really don't want to ruffle his feathers. And so you lose a lot of power as an employed physician. So each one, in fact, I did it in my book, Pros and Cons of Being Employed versus Being the Boss, in my first book, The Doctor's Guide to Starting Your Practice Right. And I also did a series of blog pieces on my website looking at the pros and cons of this. And there are more than we just talked about. There's a lot of pros and cons. Each one has its benefit. I've done them both. I've been an employed physician here near the end, and I was in private practice for 20 years. So I've done them both. I've seen the pros and cons, and there's definitely some advantages to each thing. And you just need to decide which one has the better advantages for you and your personality.
As far as that goes, do you see for the last 5-6 years, I would say that the trend has definitely been towards the employed model. Do you see that changing at all? Do you see the percentages kind of staying about the same now? Do you see a shift or continued increase towards employment model? What are your thoughts on that?
I think what's going to happen is we're going to go employed a little bit more, and it's going to be a little bit more prominent. And then pretty soon, everybody's going to stop. And we're going to go back to the system we used to have as far as being your own boss. I think the thing that's been driving the employment issue is debt. Doctors are coming out of school with so much debt now. If they go into private practice, they get a small starting salary. If you go into employed spot, they're giving these outrageous big salaries to get you to come to their place. And so you take the hook and you go do that, and then you become their minion. And I think doctors are not liking that as well in general as they thought they would. Because if you put salary first, you won't have a happy life, a happy practice. You need to put your life first, and you're going to happen to make a good salary. And whatever you do, you're going to make a good salary. Whether you're employed or you're in private practice, you're going to make a good salary. But I think it's beginning to happen now. Doctors are starting to get fed up with being employees and the hospitals just telling them this is what you're going to do. The doctor needs to be in charge of the patient care, not an MBA who's never done medicine who's in charge of that doctor. And I think that's going to turn around. I saw this happen 20 years ago. There was a movement for hospitals to buy up physicians. And they bought them up for a while. And then pretty soon they realized that doctors who were employed don't work as hard. Their production isn't as high as the ones who were self-employed. So as soon as they became employees, production went down a little bit. Pretty soon it wasn't profitable. And one day the hospital just let all those guys go. Okay, we're not going to do this anymore. You guys are all in private practice. Just like that. One day, suddenly they were in private practice. A really good example was one of those doctors who used to call me when he was an employee. He would call me if somebody called him for a colonoscopy and he was really busy. Could you do this? I can't work it into my schedule today. Because he wasn't going to get paid more if he did that. But once he was let go from the hospital and he was on his own, he never called me to do a colonoscopy because he was too busy. He found a way to make it happen. And that's the difference between employed doctors and self-employed doctors. They don't like to say that. They don't want to say that, oh, I don't work harder, if I'm on my own. I work hard anyway. Well, you do work hard anyway, but you will still do it differently if the incentives change. You will change your patterns a little bit. You'll still work hard in both. I mean, that's the thing. We both work hard. But you'll work a little different if your incentives change.
And I think you're right. Like you said, 20 years ago, it was hospitals. Now, about 5 years ago, it was hospitals. We're actually seeing a trend in my area, and I think it's nationally, where we have private equity firms and big Wall Street corporations buying out these large physician practices. I tend to agree with you that the eventual outcome will be the same and that doctors will ultimately start working again more, at least a larger percentage will go back into private practice. Let's go to a specific topic you addressed in your book about mortgages. Outside of med school, for some physicians, mortgages tend to be either the biggest or the second biggest debt that they have. I mean, a specific example you used is Dr. Morehouse with a $600,000 mortgage. And you mentioned about needing to bill, I think, $8 million or something like that to pay off their mortgage over the course of their career. It's amazing when you think about it in that respect. Do you mind going into those kind of numbers a little bit and just kind of explaining what your thought process is there?
Yeah, I loved that example of Dr. Morehouse because if you just think about your house as a monthly payment, and that's all, then you never get a grasp of what that house is really costing you. And it's amazing what it really costs you. And I took an example there in, let's say, my case in private practice. If I bought a house with a mortgage of $600,000 and it was in the example in the book, 5.3% interest, I'm going to pay over 30 years, $600,000 in interest on that. So I'm going to pay $1.2 million for that $600,000 house. Now, if you just thought about that, when you bought the house, would you be willing to pay $1.2 million for that house? Well, you probably wouldn't have. You'd have said, no, I want the house for $600,000. Yeah, but you agreed to pay $1.2 million for the house. That's what the interest is going to do. But the thing is when you start adding the other factors, it gets worse because you had to, most people think their house is a good deduction on their income tax. Well, it turns out it's not such a good deduction as you think because it's not fully deductible. And if you make a lot of money, they start removing the deduction as well. But in that case, let's say you had to earn, and you're going to pay 40% taxes. Well, you had to earn $2 million in order to pay the $800,000 in taxes to have the $1.2 million to pay for that house. So now you're up to, you had to have a gross income of $2 million to pay for that house. But it gets worse. Let's say you're in private practice, and in mine, if your overhead was 50%, that would mean that you'd have to collect $4 million to pay for your house. But your collections, you only collect about 50% of your billings. So you'd have to bill, in private practice, would have to bill $8 million to collect $4 million, pay my overhead to have the $2 million, to pay the $800,000 in income tax so that I could pay the $600,000 principal and the $600,000 interest on my house. So now, in order for me to buy a house with a $600,000 mortgage on 30 years, I have to bill $8 million worth of medical care.
It's amazing when you think about it in that respect. And I think you're right. Most of us only think about it as the 600,000, but it would boggle our mind, and we would probably be a lot more conservative if we thought about it the way you mentioned it. So I think that's very good advice to think about it in terms of how much work you have to do to pay for things.
But the more powerful piece is, what if you did that all in 7 years instead of 30? And if you go through all the calculations, I won't repeat them all, but the difference between how much you would have had to pay 7 years versus 30 equates to, on average, 17,000 extra patients that you're going to need to see. So if you paid your house off in 7 years instead of 30 years, and that meant you didn't have to see those extra 17,000 patients to pay for that extra interest, what could you do with your life if you could subtract 17,000 patients?
Absolutely.
Every Monday off for 10 years? I mean, how many is 17,000 patients in your practice? It's an astounding figure. And that's just by saying, I'm going to pay off my house in 7 years instead of 30. Now I can see 17,000 fewer patients. Now I have room in my life for my life.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. The freedom that allows you is tremendous. And whether you choose to continue working at the same pace and building up your assets, or like you say, taking time off and just kind of giving yourself more freedom, I think it's thinking about finances in that way really helps change your mindset. Let me ask you this now, more specifically to today's interest rates are obviously a little bit lower. Would you still give the same advice in terms of people who think, okay, well, my interest rate is 3%. With tax deductions, it might be effectively 2%. I could probably do better investing that money. What's your advice to people who think about it that way?
The key word in that whole statement was probably. You could probably do better. If you pay your interest off and you stop the sucking sound as the interest is going away from you, you will be better off. So what I like to tell people is low interest is still not no interest. And I liken it to a cigarette smoker who comes to the office and says, listen, I was smoking 2 packs a day. Now I'm down to 5 cigarettes a day. And that's how much I'm going to smoke the rest of my life, just 5, because that's way less than 20.
Right.
Okay, well, that's the same thing with the interest deal. I was paying 8%, but now I'm paying 2%. So I'm just going to pay 2% forever. Well, the deal is, why do you think banks have such big, beautiful buildings in the city? Because they make a lot of money. And where do they get it from? They get it from your pocket. And so anytime interest is flowing away from you, that's bad. Anytime interest is flowing toward you, that's good. Even if it's flowing away from you at a slower pace, it's still flowing away from you. So if you get rid of the payments, even whatever the payment is, even at a low interest rate, removing the payment from your monthly life will make a huge change. Even if it was 0% interest, if you still have to make $1,000 a month payment, as soon as you get rid of that, you have $1,000 a month available to you.
Right.
So I don't believe that low interest makes it better. It's still bad. I would prefer to have 2% interest going against me than 8% interest. That's true.
Sure.
But as long as it's going against me, it's still a bad thing. It's just less bad. It's like, I'm going to quit robbing banks, so I'm going to cut down to just, one bank a month.
Right.
No, you got to stop.
Right.
It needs to stop. The flow has to stop and then turn around and flow toward you. And I think people will do better if they change the mindset that debt is okay if it's lower. It's still not okay. It is a little better than it was before, but best is what you're after. Go for best. And best means you don't owe anybody any money, and everything you earn, you get to keep.
Right. I think all those are good. And I think, I was looking on the internet prior to our discussion talking about mortgage versus investment calculators, and they're kind of split amongst their recommendations, whether you should invest or not. But either way, I mean, the key thing is the freedom that the payoff provides you, I think, is something that you can't necessarily put into numerical terms. So that type of freedom, I think, is probably worth a few extra percentage points than a very high investment return.
Almost all of those calculations are based on that you can do only one or the other. And for most physicians, that's not true. For most physicians, you can do both. You can pay down your debt faster, and you can invest a lot of money for the future. So most physicians have enough money. If they haven't screwed up their lifestyle and set it so high that they're spending everything they have, if they haven't done that to themselves, most physicians have enough money that they can do both. They can invest for the future and accelerate their debt payments. They don't have to do one or the other. And almost all of those discussions are based on pick one. You either pay off your debt or you invest for the future. And we don't have to do that. High-income people can do both.
Right. So let me ask you, you mentioned that you do coaching to physicians. It's financial coaching, is that correct?
I do two kinds of coaching. One is financial, basically a makeover of your personal finances so that we can get you back on the right track. And the other one is I do high-performance coaching for those people who want to take their life to the next level. So I kind of do those two different things depending on what you need. Most people really want to get their finances back in order. And the biggest problem is they haven't been paying attention to them. So I basically teach you how to pay attention to it the right way and to set everything up right so you're moving in the right direction. And those are the kind of two programs that I do with doctors.
And then you also, like you said, you just finished your surgical career, but you're still doing other stuff. You're doing the coaching. You've written books, and you are writing another book currently? Yes.
The next book comes out probably in May, and that's The Doctor's Guide to Smart Career Alternatives and Retirement. A lot of doctors today are talking about quitting. Oh, I want to quit doing this. Well, you have a lot of experience and you have a degree. And there are people other than patients who would pay you for that knowledge. And so there are other career alternatives that you could do besides see patients with your knowledge. And that's what that book's about. And then if you really did decide you're just going to quit, okay, let me show you how to retire with style, So that's what the next book is. We've actually got the Doctor's Guide to series that I'm writing is actually going to probably be around a dozen books, each one on a slightly different topic. Book 4 and 5 are already lined out, and they'll be coming out, following this. So I'm going to put a whole series of books helping doctors with different aspects of their life, both financially and having a better life in general.
Great. Well, we're looking forward to those. Like I said, I just finished reading Eliminating Debt, and I'm going to read your first book. Was it Starting a Practice Right? Is that what it was?
Yeah, The Doctor's Guide to Starting Your Practice Right.
And then we'll look forward to the other ones. I want to thank you, Dr. Fawcett, for participating in our podcast. And just for our listeners, where can they find more about you?
My website is drcorysfawcett.com, and I have a lot of information there on that website. And picking up the books will help. You can get those at Amazon. I've got a YouTube channel with some videos that'll be helpful. They're little vignettes of 3 to 5 minutes long. You can find me on Facebook, on Twitter, and on LinkedIn.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. I want to thank my guest today, Dr. Cory Fawcett. Dr. Fawcett's book, Eliminating Debt, is available on Amazon. On this show is for your education and entertainment only. Please consult the appropriate experts to assess your own financial situation. We'll be back soon with another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. If you subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, you'll automatically be updated with when a new episode is available for download. The same thing applies to Google Play or Stitcher. And if you get a moment, please leave us a positive review on one of these podcast sites. It really improves our rankings and helps get the word out to other people who would benefit from the show.